My name's Tony Myers. I'm a professor in quantitative methods at Birmingham University, and this presentation is on the dark side of mental toughness in elite sport. So we're going to look at what mental toughness is, the challenges and perspectives on defining and conceptualising mental toughness, the dark side of mental toughness, examples of what might be considered adaptive and maladaptive mental toughness practices and behaviours, and then sum this up in a conclusion. We hear the word mental toughness mentioned a lot in sport, whether that's by commentators, coaches, players. But what actually is mental toughness? In a wonderfully critical chapter, Who's Mental, Who's Tough, Who's Both? Mutton Constructs Dressed Up as Lamb, Mark Anderson wrote this chapter in Mental Toughness in Development and decided to list some of the things that people had said about mental toughness, all the words used to describe this construct, including the following list: determination, perseverance, having goals, meticulous preparation, time management, being inspirational, personal values, honesty, pride in performance, accountability, discipline, commitment, control, challenge, positivity, professionalism, accepting sacrifices, concentration and focus. And the list goes on. He also highlighted a definition that he thought was actually unusual, but one that's frequently used in the literature.
Mental toughness is having the natural or developed psychological edge that enables you to, generally, cope better than your opponents with the many demands, competition, training, lifestyle that sport places on a performer, and, specifically, be more consistent and better than your opponents in remaining determined, focused, confident, and into control under pressure.
As Anderson points out, this seems to depend completely on someone's opponents. But there's also, he pointed out, other problems with sort of what fantasies and absolute language. For example,
a collection of values, attitudes, behaviours and emotions that enable you to persevere and overcome any obstacle, adversity or pressure experienced, but also to maintain concentration and motivation when things are going well to consistently achieve your goals.
To overcome any obstacle, adversity or pressure sounds more like a fantasy than reality, a superhero rather than a human. Anderson suggests that science doesn't use the language of fantasy. And to be fair, Alex and I would agree that science doesn't. However, the caveat is, a developing player is not a scientist and doesn't use or consider things necessarily in that way. So what might be a really good definition to a psychologist isn't necessarily what particular psychological constructs like mental toughness, how they're understood by athletes, developing athletes or otherwise, or coaches. What truly matters is how players and coaches perceive and internalise ideas about mental toughness, even if they're involving imaginary heroes and unrealistic ideas gleaned from their understanding of elite sport. Our beliefs definitely shape our mental toughness. Alex and I believe that to truly understand mental toughness, we should not only look at actual actions and attitudes, which we agree are really important, but we should also consider the stories and narratives and the beliefs that motivate those actions.
My name is Alex Powell and I'm a senior lecturer in sports coaching. My research area is predominantly in the development of mental toughness and specifically in rugby union.
Though Alex in his PhD looked at mental toughness and its development in rugby union utilising ecological systems theory, which is a useful theory, I think, to look at various levels of influence. We'll have a look at, he looked at a lot more than this, but we'll look at where the narrative might insert itself in the wider culture of particular sports. So in this theoretical framework, we've got the individual in what we call a microsystem, and that is their immediate setting. So it's things like coaches, parents, relatives, friends, and those who are training elite squads, sports scientists, perhaps sports medicine staff, etc. So those that have an immediate impact. This is sort of a local culture, so which will be influenced by a wider culture, but might be quite different too. And its values and beliefs in that very small group of people that direct personal contacts. Alex looked at this is where perceived technical competence and self-improvement and consistency was where that sort of is framed within in the overall ecological systems. And we think that local narratives, individual stories from parents, relatives, from all personal, this is where this can be influenced. So individuals might have very different stories, very different ideals than other people even in the same team. The next level of system is the mesosystem. And this is sort of like an interconnection among other systems. So it's like a club or a group, depending on the sort of sport people are involved in, of competitors beyond the immediately personal. And narratives from the club or wider context can be important. I know certainly from my own sport, which is Muay Thai, individuals about, have really built the way they see their attitudes and beliefs by listening to narratives and stories about those who've been involved in the club before they started and the things they've endured. And so that's been quite an important, I think, way that values are developed. Then we've got the exosystem, which might be the individual sport, for example. And this is the national sports culture, beliefs and values, which are broader than the immediate club. And here, the sports elite, champions' behaviours, etc., those narratives, those wider narratives, where people might not have ever met these people, but the stories are there, so they're possibly even more likely to be unrealistic. But they can also influence and shape people's behaviour and beliefs about mental toughness. Then finally we've got the macro system, really national, international influences. So broader social media, not sort of immediate social media where it might be much more local, and public media. And this is where the broader elite and what a champion's behaviour in beyond the sport maybe that are influence this at this level. So what stories are told about mental toughness? What might have influenced or be influencing athletes? So Alex in his study took a purposive sample of players and coaches identified by others as regularly demonstrating mentally tough behaviours. They were recruited either directly or through gatekeepers. The sample comprised of 8 elite players and coaches with an age range from 26 to 71. These players collectively appeared in 411 international rugby matches, competing as part of World Cup winning teams, represented the British Lions and took part in the Six Nations Grand Slam. So what did they say? Well, these are some examples from quotes. They're not all the examples, but there's some that we think point to a darker side of mental toughness.
Perhaps some of the darkest days of my life, that pressure of what losing does to your immediate family, and that puts huge pressure on them. So the commitment to do that, to put your family second a lot of the time. From Christmas to the World Cup, out of 130 days I was away from home for 108.
10 minutes into the game he strained his hamstring. Our tight head went off, so we would have been down to our 2 reserve props, and he stayed on until half-time, running around on a hamstring that is dodgy, on dodgy calves, and still jackling on the ball, still scrummaging. That is a great example of a great player showing unbelievable mental and physical toughness to hang in there for his team.
He was the archetypical leader in English rugby, someone who tended to get his own way, who could lead by. But I saw him not to be led by, but somebody to be beat. I wanted to take him on personally, to actually beat this man. And if I couldn't beat him, I wouldn't want to play with him. It was that belligerence to want to actually dominate that man.
In another example of physical and mental toughness in rugby, popular social media has asked if Buck Shelford, a former captain of New Zealand, the All Blacks, is the toughest rugby player ever, highlighting a combination of physical and mental toughness in some clips. Let's just take a look at an example.
And got booted right in the face, and I lost 3 teeth on my right hand side. So I just carried on, got on with the game. And then about 10 minutes into the second half, and as I stood up, Daniel kicked me right in the nuts. Man, did it bloody hurt. And I thought nothing of it. And I carried on playing. And the All Black changing room was very, very morbid, very, very quiet after a loss. Decided to get dressed. I stood up, ripped my gear off, pulled my strides down. And then one of the guys from across the room, and they said, "Holy shit, look at that." One of my testicles had been ripped right out of the scrotum, and it was hanging between my legs, and then basically went upstairs into a medical room and got it all tidied up and put back together. And, just these sort of things do happen, and you've just got to play on.
There's a trend in sport, and even in sports psychology, that frames mental toughness as a purely positive construct. But there seems to be a dark side in some of those quotes we've just listened to. Some of the subtext really doesn't suggest that it's as wholesome as it might be seen in some instances. What would an example of maladaptive mental toughness be? And what would an example of adaptive or positive mental toughness be? Let's take a look first of all at maladaptive mental toughness. I'm going to look at a short clip of a fight that I watched as a child, with on the edge of my seat, as many other people did, the Thriller in Manila, which was the famous fight between legendary boxers Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, their famous third fight.
Frazier's badly hurt. Doctor comes up and looks at Frazier. I think it's going to be over. It's all over.
Would you have been willing to risk your life to go out for that final round?
Yeah. So Frazier confirmed that he would have been willing to risk his life by going out for that 15 round. In other words, he was prepared to die for a sporting competition, risk his life to go out where he'd been really seriously beaten. He also, his opponent, Muhammad Ali, had also been seriously beaten. Now that is maladaptive. That can't be anything else. That is the culture that he'd absorbed. But you know what, strangely enough, I completely understand him. And that sounds weird, but I do. Having coached fighters, in fact, I'm sort of almost ashamed to say that that's sort of what I expect fighters to be prepared to do. Although I expect the corner to pull them out. I expect nobody to allow them to do that. But I almost expect them to be willing to do it. And that's maladaptive. But that's also the culture that I've absorbed. I don't think it's adaptive, and I don't think it's positive at all, though. Now let's look at an example of adaptive mental toughness, and we'll look at mental toughness in mountaineers. Examples really from quotes from participants in 2 studies, but that actually show real mental toughness.
I think the reason a lot of people get killed is that they don't think of the top as halfway. They think of it as most of the way. Or they even forget and think, well, I know I can get to the top, and that's all they focus on rather than thinking, I know I can get to the top and back down. I need to believe I've still got something left at least when on top. I'm sure people push 120% for the top sometimes too early and pay the price.
To have the mental strength to turn around, that's often much more difficult than carrying on. I mean, if you can already see the summit of Everest, you've just spent 7 weeks, you've spent $60,000, but your expedition leader tells you that you're getting into trouble if you carry on. Turning around then takes huge mental strength.
We've seen some examples of mental toughness are both really adaptive and positive in the case of mountaineers, rational and balanced thought, despite pressures to go on in the face of where they probably shouldn't, and they chose the difficult choice of turning back. We also looked at Joe Frazier, the example where we saw a legendary boxer who's prepared to die for the sport. And many boxers who've gone before him have also clearly had that attitude. Unless there's a huge culture shift with different stories told about the sporting legends in a particular area, that's likely to continue. And so there's likely still to be some narratives out there that mean that people will choose maladaptive mental toughness. In the rugby examples, mental toughness values permeated participants' life philosophy and judgment calls. They were keenly aware of the external values, social conformity pressures, and alternative moralities, but at times chose to challenge these with their actions and choices. In sharp contrast to current literature on developing mental toughness, the environment that players and coaches in the rugby study felt was important for developing mental toughness was a threatening and stressful environment, where the more mentally tough self-affirm and demonstrate dominance and ultimately thrive in elite rugby. Now, whilst there are a number of really useful models of mental toughness in its development, there are none to our knowledge that propose mental toughness can be adaptive or maladaptive, or the importance of the stories of athletes that they're exposed to, and the culture this develops. We feel the dark side of mental toughness warrants more attention from a research perspective.